To our speaker today. I am so honored to welcome Tony Finitsis from PLU. As you know, we're just a few miles south of PLU, such an incredible resource to have in our, I don't know if it's our backyard, front yard. And yet, in the time I've been here, you're not the first ever, but just in my time, the first one to join us and that we can learn from you. So thank you so much for being here. I know I have a few handouts, so I will pass those out.
Thank you.
And please join me in welcoming Tony.
Hello, good morning. Thank you for the invitation. I'm very glad to be here. As Pastor Leah said, we're just in your own backyard, so it's a pleasure to see the people in our community. We don't get that opportunity very much. I see the children of our community, but not the other people in our community. Before I begin, a few things. I will do something. I'm at PLU. I teach the Hebrew Bible. I'm a professor there. I also direct the Wild Hope Center for Vocation. And a very unlikely thing for a Hebrew Bible Old Testament professor to do is discuss the New Testament. We have very clear division of labor. We do the Hebrew Bible, the Ancient Near East, and my colleagues do the New Testament. Today, I'm going to dabble in New Testament. I've been trained in New Testament. We just have a very clear division of labor. But since the topic today, that's what Pastor Lydia told me you guys wanted information on, social justice, is something that very nicely goes with the New Testament. I have an overview. So I will be here next Sunday. We'll see how far along we get today, and we'll continue our conversation next Sunday. Know that I will, wherever I am, I will stop around 12:20 for Q&A, so that if you have questions that you want to ask, we'll have time for that. The other thing that we were not organized enough, I have a PowerPoint. I don't have a clicker. So every so often I will have to say next, so that we see the next slide. Thank you, John, for that. And you're going to be seeing some things together. There's also a handout that goes around if you want to sit with someone next to you close so you can share. It's the text, mostly of the Bible, that I'm going to be bringing up today. So I'm going to begin. The title is Social Justice. That's what Pastor Lilia asked me to talk about. And it's a very apropos topic to discuss, I think. Distribution of wealth nowadays is not equitable, neither is social privilege. Power is located in the hands of the few, and that creates a series of relational problems within our society. Namely, the disenfranchised are silenced and their basic human rights are taken away. This was exactly the same situation in the biblical world. Not much progress, I'm sad to say. Several books in the Bible make it a priority to establish a just and equitable society. Legal and prophetic voices alike have been emphasizing the importance of social justice. Prophet Amos declared justice and righteousness as the prime religious duty for anyone who professes to live according to the will of God. Sadly, the quest to ensure that every human being is being treated justly and fairly remains unfulfilled to this day. Thus, it is important to keep repeating the plea, hoping that sooner rather than later, we will become better at ensuring justice for all. Today, I will argue that according to religious Near Eastern thought, social justice is the paragon of a healthy, cohesive society. Next. In the socio-historical and cultural context of the Bible, poverty, oppression, and marginalization are religious crimes. Political leaders are accountable to God when failing to stop the powerful from oppressing the weak. Amos, in the Old Testament, explained the connection between religion and social justice. Jesus, in the New Testament, showed what ought to be done in order for outcasts to be incorporated back into society so that there are no more marginalized people. Next, I will attempt to prove my point through a close reading of primary texts. I will conduct my examination within the socio-historical and cultural context of the ancient Near East, and I will also offer my personal interpretation of the implications of my analysis for our current world. Next, I will follow a historical sequence of presentation of my survey, moving from the ancient to the more recent. Accordingly, I will begin with an investigation of the laws of Hammurabi, and I will move to specific laws from Exodus and Deuteronomy. I will continue with the message of Prophet Amos before reaching Jesus. I will conclude with a contemporary reflection. So we begin in the ancient Near East, ancient Mesopotamia. The cause for social justice finds its earliest advocate in the person of King Hammurabi in ancient Babylon. He is most famous for creating a monument that preserves one of the most ancient law codes. Next. And we see it. This code has been named quite suitably after the king. Hammurabi is the sixth and best attested of the 11 kings in the so-called First Dynasty of Babylon. He was king around 1800s before the Common Era, give or take 4,000 years ago. The absolute dates of his reign remain uncertain. This 7.5-foot high basalt stela originally contained 282 laws. Multiple copies of the stela were made and were placed in major cities throughout the kingdom. Hammurabi's stela was discovered in 1901 Common Era. It was not discovered in Babylon, where it was put by the king, but in Susa, Persia, where it had been taken as booty by the Elamites, who raided Babylon approximately 5 centuries after the time of Hammurabi. Many of the laws were effaced from the stone, but thankfully the contents of the stela were preserved in multiple copies that date as late as the first millennium BCE. Hammurabi's laws are understood as an amalgamation of diverse traditions in a newly unified country under his rule. Therefore, he is not to be understood as an innovator offering new legislation. He collected laws that already existed, so the laws are way older than Hammurabi, way older than 2,000 years before the Common Era. The code exemplifies two key legal principles that are still relevant. First, these laws were binding for the entire kingdom, so that at least in theory, the penalties for the crimes were fixed for all and not subjected to individual whim and partiality. It's what nowadays we would call federal law. Yes, it applies across the country. Second, justice were to be proportionately retributive. What we nowadays say the punishment should fit the crime. Thank you. In Latin, this legal principle is known as lex talionis. Next. The relief in the sculpture at the top of the stela presents Hammurabi receiving from Shamash, the god of sun and wisdom, the symbols of justice and authority. You can see the scepter, and you can see the ring in the hand of King God Shamash. This image is appropriate in two ways. First, it reflects the hierarchical society of the ancient Near East by presenting the king as lower and accountable to gods. Second, it corresponds to the content of the stone, which lists the laws that the king distributed in the land. The laws in this monument are framed by a prologue and an epilogue. Both the prologue and the epilogue place the law in religious context. The prologue describes how the gods exalted Marduk and made Babylon's name supreme in the regions of the world. At that time, for the enhancement of the well-being of the people, they also named Hammurabi, next, as shepherd whose task was to make justice prevail in the land, to abolish the wicked and the evil, to prevent the strong from oppressing the weak. There are 4 elements that are worth noting in this prologue. First, Hammurabi does not legislate. This means that it is God who is the ultimate source of legal authority. The human king or the judges serve God's law. The point is reinforced later when the king states that it was Marduk who commanded him to provide just ways for the people of the land, and so he established truth and justice as the declaration of the land. Second, Hammurabi may be a king, but he answers to a higher authority. That is, he is answerable for his actions and his duties. More to the point, duties towards the gods are mentioned repeatedly in the prologue. Third, humans ultimately belong to gods. The king does not own them. He may rule over humans, but only as a regent. In the epilogue, Hammurabi clarifies that humankind was granted to his care by the god Enlil, and that Marduk had charged him with shepherding all humans. Lastly, his task as leader is to prevent the strong from oppressing the weak. The true measure for a successful leader in the ancient Near East is not dependent on the prosperity and wealth he brings to ruling class. It is determined by the extent with which he cares for the weak and the oppressed. It was obvious 4,000 years ago that the interests of the strong did not need defending. The strong had their wealth and power to protect them. The weak, on the other hand, were defenseless. Hammurabi then concludes his prologue fittingly with a statement, "I enhanced the well-being of the people." That was the justification for his kingship. In the epilogue, Hammurabi calls on the gods and goddesses to curse any future ruler who breaks the laws or defaces the stele. Here he also underscores the public nature of his collection by highlighting their universal availability. Next. Let any oppressed man who has a cause come into the presence of the statue of me, the King of Justice, and then read carefully my inscribed stele, and give heed to my precious words, and may my stele make the case clear to him. May he understand his cause, may he set his mind at ease. The goal of the stele was not only to catalog law. It also meant to be tangible evidence for the king's care of all the people in the land, and to provide a safe haven to anyone that entered the presence of the stele. Furthermore, its goal was to comfort people who were distraught and persecuted. Scholar van der Meerop offers that current scholarly consensus regards that the function of the stele was not to offer a compilation of law. Rather, it was meant to present Hammurabi as an exemplary king of justice. Instead of a list of legal precepts, the entire monument is a vivid expression of Hammurabi as a king who provides justice in his land. The 282 law cases were listed in order to achieve a two-pronged goal. First, to prove his ability to guarantee justice, and second, to inspire future kings to study and follow his example. Put differently, this was an aspirational document meant to impress the importance of social justice both to Hammurabi's contemporaries and to subsequent generations. The concern for the protection of the marginalized and the powerless is also prominent in the Bible. Particularly, it becomes a central theme in biblical law. Unfortunately, the examination of biblical law in connection with human rights has been nullified in historical critical scholarship under the towering influence of Julius Wellhausen. If you don't know Julius Wellhausen, I will tell you just this. He didn't like law, and he didn't make a secret out of it. The legal material is introduced in the Old Testament in the book of Exodus, after the Israelites cross the sea and assemble in Mount Sinai. Next, chapter 20 reads, "Then God spoke all these words, I am the Lord, your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me." This is the beginning, as you probably all of you know, of the Ten Commandments. Specifically, this is the commandment that introduces the deity. It identifies the one who gives the law. Most importantly, it explains why God gives the law. The redeeming of Israel from slavery is what gives God the authority to give the commandments that follow. This has two practical implications. First, we cannot separate the commandments from their literary setting, the liberation from slavery, and the subsequent covenant with God and the Israelites. And second, we cannot skip over the legal material. The laws are essential to the story of Israel and to their relationship with God. The experience of slavery in Egypt was a constitutive part for the ancient Israelite identity. According to Deuteronomy chapter 26, Israelites had to recite the following prayer each time they were giving an offering to the priest. Next. "A wandering Aramean was my ancestor. He went down into Egypt and lived there as an alien, few in number, and there he became a great nation, mighty and populous. When the Egyptians treated us harshly and afflicted us by imposing hard labor on us, we cried to the Lord, the God of our ancestors. The Lord heard our voice and saw our affliction, our toil, and our oppression." Because of their history, they were very sensitive towards issues of slavery. The most common cause that would drive a person to slavery in the ancient world, much like our world, was debt. This is the reason why the book of Deuteronomy obsesses about the protection of the orphan, the widow, and the resident alien. Without a family to look after them, a dry year was only what separated orphans and widows from slavery. This is the reason why Deuteronomy 15, there is a law about the sabbatical year. Next. "Every 7th year you shall grant a remission of debts, and this is the manner of the remission. Every creditor shall remit the claim that is held against the neighbor, not exacting it of a neighbor who is a member of the community." For Deuteronomy, the welfare of the community as a whole was a priority over against the economic prosperity of individuals. member of your community, whether a Hebrew man or a Hebrew woman, you still hear me? Okay. If a member of your community, whether a Hebrew man or a Hebrew woman, is sold to you and works for you 6 years, in the 7th year you shall set that person free. It is ironic that they allowed slavery, given their self-understanding as slaves in Egypt, but at the same time it is noteworthy that they were honest about slavery. Next. And that they had legal frameworks to keep it in check. In the book of Exodus, we find a law that corresponds directly with a law in Hammurabi's Stele. Supposedly, it addresses the Israelites right after they escaped Egypt while in the Sinai desert. The first part of this law relates to accidental miscarriage. The case revolves around 2 men who fight and accidentally injure a pregnant woman. This part of the law has a particularly tortured history of interpretation, but my focus today is on the legal consequence. Next. If any harm follows, then you shall give life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, wound for wound, stripe for stripe. This legal formula has often been listed as a prime example of the shortcomings of the Old Testament. It has been singled out as an example of a primitive and vengeful community. It has even been argued that if the eye for an eye law was still in effect, then we would all be blind. There are several basic misunderstandings around this claim. First, the claim seems to assume a society in which all are equal. Next. And in which we all have the same standing in a court of law. In contrast, the ancient Near East is a hierarchical society with free people, dependents, and slaves. This law is establishing the idea that the punishment should fit the crime. The argument might be made that in our modern society, we're all equal in a court of law. The argument could be true theoretically, if not for all the cases in which celebrities and people with power seem to escape justice with a mere slap on the hand and a warning meant to keep up appearances. Second, both in the ancient Near Eastern codes and in the biblical ones, there were provisions for accepting monetary compensation instead of the corporal punishment. Lastly, this law code does not advocate vengefulness. It tries to curb excessive retaliation by introducing the measure of equal punishment. The goal is to present justice as proportionately retributive. This also seems at times to be an unattainable goal in our modern society. In highly litigious systems, excessive retaliation is often the ambition for an early retirement. A representative example could be the next Liebig versus McDonald's restaurants product liability lawsuit in 1994. In this lawsuit, a New Mexico civil jury awarded $2.86 million to plaintiff Stella Liebig, a 79-year-old woman who suffered third-degree burns when she accidentally spilled hot coffee in her lap after purchasing it from a McDonald's restaurant. Although the plaintiff suffered third-degree burns and was hospitalized for more than a week, the $2.86 million awarded in compensatory and punitive damages seem excessive for the damages incurred. The fact that this case eventually got resolved via secret settlement, which was never disclosed to the public, negates the purpose of the legal principle the punishment should fit the crime. In order to maintain the cohesion of the social fabric, society members need to be assured that justice is fair and equitable. They need to be assured that the law does not apply selectively and that the standards are the same for all. With the undisclosed settlement, there is no way to know whether or not punishment inflicted corresponded in degree and kind to the offense of the wrongdoer. What is at stake, I want to repeat, is the cohesion of the social fabric, our welfare as a community. The cause for the protection of the impoverished and the underprivileged is a major theme in biblical prophets. The first writing prophet who pressed the issue was Amos, next, in the 8th century before the Common Era. He prophesied at a time when the kingdom of Israel was extremely prosperous. However, the wealth was not divided equitably. Rather, it seems that the powerful were enjoyed a life of luxury at the expense of the poor, and that vexed the prophet. If one reads the book of Amos in Hebrew, there are two words that keep appearing again and again: mispat and tzedakah, justice and righteousness. These two words carry the theology of the book. Justice is understood in the sense of respecting human beings and in the sense of behaving in a way that promotes equity and harmony in a community. Righteousness is defined in the sense of being honest and forthright instead of crooked. For Amos, justice and righteousness equal respect and honesty. This is the reason why Amos has been viewed as the biblical champion of social justice. Amos had a very hard message to deliver to King Jeroboam and the people of Israel. This came as a judgment from God for their failure to uphold justice, honesty, kindness, and compassion. Next. For thus Amos has said, Jeroboam shall die by the sword, and Israel must go into exile away from this land. With a single verse, the prophet summarily declares the death of the king, possibly the end of the dynasty, followed by the end of the kingdom and the captivity and forced migration of the population. Why? The economic prosperity of Israel made this message of doom and destruction very hard to accept. People considered their wealth and security as evidence that God was pleased. The peace and prosperity of the nation that the nation enjoyed must have in their mind validated their values, their lives, and assumptions about appropriate religious behavior. In contradiction, Amos is ruthless in his denunciation of the ruling class. Next. Hear this word, you cows of Bashan, who are on the Mount Samaria, who oppress the poor, who crush the needy, who say to their husbands, bring something to drink. Woe for those who lie on beds of ivory and lounge on their couches, and eat lambs from the flock and calves from the stall, who drink wine from bowls and anoint themselves with the finest oils, but are not grieved over the ruin of Joseph. Amos paints a picture of opulence in which wealthy people lounge in expensive furnishings, anoint themselves and drink wine. Notably, they also eat meat. Meat at the time was eaten rarely in everyday life. Most people were able to consume it only on important holidays. This leads Anderson and Friedman to argue that the subtext of this image is the parody of a cultic celebration. What bothers Amos further is that the delight of luxury was at the expense of social justice. The wealthy not only built their riches with other people's money, they also display a callous disregard for those they oppressed. They were so absorbed with the pursuit of profit and the maintenance of their lavish lifestyle that Israel had turned into a violent, oppressive, and exploitative society, making a mockery of the justice and equity that were the foundation and cornerstone of Israelite society. The point that Amos wants to make is that Israel's conduct in the holy place was at odds with their attitude in the marketplace. The poor had to sell themselves into slavery to pay off trivial debts. Next. The rich falsified weights and measures. Next. And traded dishonestly. Next. The courts, the last bastion of hope for the poor, were corrupt. Judges were bribed to cheat the poor out of what little they had. Next. In fact, Israel was no longer capable of acting with justice. Next. They hated truth and honesty. Next. Nevertheless, they fulfilled their ceremonial and sacrificial duties towards God lavishly. Amos denounces this hypocritical behavior. Next. I despise your festivals, and I take no delight in your solemn assemblies. Even though you offer me burnt offerings, I will not accept them. And the offerings of well-being of your fatted animals I will not look upon. Take away from me the noise of your songs. I will not listen to the melody of your harps. Ancient Israelites appear to have exceedingly pious, almost perfect conduct in the sanctuary. Amos declares that God's anger against Israel is so great that he no longer accepts prayers or sacrifices from them. This is one of the most scathing denunciations of religious expression in the Bible. The prophet claims that God is disgusted at their religious practices. Ancient Israelites assumed that their steadfast devotion to ritual exempted them from the requirements of righteousness and social justice and from the consequences of wrongdoing. They believed that through hymn and sacrifice they could guarantee both divine favor and their own survival. In contrast, Amos believed that their primary religious responsibility was to uphold social justice. Next. But let justice roll down like waters, and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. Amos' critique puts in sharp focus the question of what is important in religion. For many, to be religious means to participate in the services. Amos finds the practice of elaborate religious services misleading because it makes people believe that they have fulfilled their religious obligations, when in truth they have been criminally negligent towards the very same obligations. In the words of a Jewish scholar, Shalom Paul, cultic zeal could neither engender public will nor atone for infringements upon the moral law. Ritual can never be a surrogate for ethics. For Amos, to serve God is to behave with respect and honesty towards one's neighbors. The proper divine-human relationship is based upon a correct human-to-human relationship. It is no coincidence that Martin Luther King Jr. quoted Amos in his famous "I Have a Dream" speech on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C. in 1963. This speech is a defining moment in the American civil rights movement. In a similar vein, Gandhi remarked that in his concluding pages of his autobiography, those who say that religion has nothing to do with politics do not know what religion means. One needs to unpack his point of view in order to appreciate the argument. Politics is taken from the Greek word polis, that means city. Politics is the process through which we negotiate power and mediate interests for people who live together in a city. The word religion is derived from the Latin verb religare, which means to bind together. People bound together practice religion. Thus, religion ought to shape the way people negotiate power and mediate interests. Amos, Martin Luther King Jr., and Gandhi agree that we cannot divide social, economic, political, and religious work in separate compartments. It means that we should distribute power with respect for one another and honesty. It means that our politics must not promote discrimination and deceit. I'm right about the point where I want to move on with Jesus, but I'm running out of time. I think I'm going to finish with Jesus and see if we have time for Q&A. How do people feel like? Or do you want me to stop here? Okay. The cause for the protection of the weak was taken over by Jesus in the New Testament. Though there is contemporary scholarly disagreement about Jesus as a teacher, the agreement is about Jesus as a teacher of subversive wisdom. There is less agreement about the extent that his teachings directly concern socio-political issues of the day. This is mainly due to two factors. First is the legacy of the eschatological understanding of the message of Jesus. If Jesus believed that the world was about to end, he would hardly have been concerned about the socio-political structure of his day. Why be concerned about it? It's all going to end. Second, there has been a tendency to understand Jesus' teachings in an individualistic mode. Recently, however, a number of scholars have argued in various ways that Jesus was political in a different sense, not as a leader against Roman rule, but as one who sought a transformation of his own people's socio-political life. Central to the connection is how politics is defined. If politics is defined, as I defined it a minute earlier, as what political leaders do, then it's difficult to see a political thrust to Jesus' message and mission. But if politics is understood as a concern for the sake of the polis, for the sake of the city, and by extension, a concern for the sake of any community, there is considerable evidence of strong socio-political component to Jesus' teaching. Particularly relevant for this conversation are his teachings about a transformation for both the individual and social existence. The traditions about Jesus report harsh criticism directed against the ruling elites of wealth, power, and righteousness. He spoke woes against the rich. Next. One more. There. And against the scribes who used the law for monetary gain. Next. Stories which begin once there was a rich man do not turn out good. Next. According to Mark, he charged the wealthy religious elite who controlled the temple with having made it into a den of robbers. Next. By the way, he took that from Prophet Jeremiah, I should say, because I'm a Hebrew Bible scholar. And accused them of being unfaithful, murderous tenants of the vineyard of Israel. Next. Jesus' social behavior, particularly his curses and exorcisms, elicited faith from some and at the same time provoked skepticism by others. His initiative toward social outcasts elicited the joyous response of the outcasts, but also provoked shock and resentment on the part of the learned and the pious. To his contemporaries, it was a staggering phenomenon that Jesus did not shrink from dining with the irreligious. Next. To grasp the issue of Jesus' initiative towards and fellowship with sinners, one has to define the term sinners. The classic treatment of the issue is that of Professor Joachim Jeremias. He rightly maintained that the sinners in the Gospels did not refer to the unobservant, the so-called people of the land, but to those who notoriously violated the commandments of God and to those who engaged in universally despised trades, especially usurers and tax collectors, practitioners of which were deprived of civil and political rights. In ancient Judaism, sinners stood publicly and for the most part permanently condemned. Repentance and the conversion were possible in Judaism. However, the sequence in which they were accepted made repentance impossible. First, one had to repent, second, convert, and last, reintegrate into the community. The innovation of Jesus' initiative was the reversal of the sequence. Tax collectors, for example, had no way of knowing all whom they have robbed, nor how much. Thus, they had no way to make the required complete restitution plus a fifth. In this seemingly hopeless situation, Jesus' approach to the sinners proved to be irresistible. Contact prompted repentance. Conversion flowered from communion. Jesus' policy did not aim to win the sinner back to God, but also restore him to his rightful family. Thus, his ministry was aimed at bringing the outcasts back into the community. Jesus, through a series of parables, he mounted an appeal to the righteous to enter with their brothers, the sinners, into a fellowship of forgiveness. The story of the prodigal son ends on this note of poignant appeal with the words of the father to the elder son. Next. But we had to celebrate and be glad because your brother was dead and has come back to life. He was lost and is found. The response of the elder son is left open and undecided. It would be settled only by the response that the audience himself would make to Jesus' parable. I found the idea that Jesus' word called for our response to complete their goal intriguing. I will use this idea to return to lex talionis that we found in Exodus in the Gospel of Matthew. Jesus cites this law as an example of the old order that he wants to change. Next. You have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. That was the law in Exodus. But I say to you, do not resist an evildoer. But if anyone strikes you on the right cheek, turn the other also. If anyone wants to sue you and take your coat, give your cloak as well. Give to everyone who begs from you, and do not refuse anyone who wants to borrow from you. The way in which Jesus changes lex talionis led people to believe that the law in the Old Testament was primitive and vengeful, and that the law in the New Testament is enlightened and superior. I like to qualify this statement with two observations. First, the law in the Old Testament addresses escaped slaves in the Sinai desert that have nothing in common other than the fact that they're now free. The goal of law is to establish the basics for this community. The law in the New Testament addresses a lawful, organized community. Thus, of course, this law attempts to build on the first. Second, even nowadays, as a lawful and organized community, we struggle, often unsuccessfully, to live by the Old Testament law. We live in a community where people dream of the lawsuit that will allow them to retire. I believe that we should move beyond observation of comparative piety if we are to understand Jesus' words. Jesus was not trying to replace lex talionis with a superior law. I believe that Jesus was trying to get us to arrive at the same point, that justice is proportionately retributive, that punishment should fit the crime, but from a different avenue. He aimed to get us to understand the circumstances that led a person to strike us on the cheek and to sue us for our coat. Our immediate reaction would be to feel wrong and seek retribution. Jesus is asking us to put our interests aside for a moment and ponder all the things we have done or neglected to do that caused the evildoer to take action. Nobody is completely innocent. Jesus wants us to feel in our skin the way that person felt. Only then we join in community with the oppressed. We will be ready to consider what we might do next to welcome the outcast back in our community. I will close with one remark about what this all means for our contemporary society. First, I need to qualify my point of view. Any biblical scholar with a conscience carries a heavy cross. To use a biblical metaphor, Professor Meeks has put it most eloquently in his address to the Society of the New Testament Literature in 2004. The Bible has been abused as many times as it has been used. Most importantly, it has been abused to justify mass murders and genocide. Next. The burden of every biblicist is to make sure to prevent any further abuse from happening. I will stop here. We have 5 minutes for question and answers. I know I dumped a lot of material your way, and you're probably still processing. But anything that I may went by too fast, this is the opportunity. Yes, please. The Bible has been abused to justify mass murders and genocide. That's why they often ask me, why do you study the Bible? Well, I'm trying to right a wrong. It's a very powerful book. I don't know if you realize that, how powerful the Bible is. And as often as people use it, there are even more times that they abuse it. It's not an election year But if this was an election year, they probably would have been thrown to our faces from the summer all the way into election. People just grab verses from the Bible for one or another candidate, and they campaign the Bible. It's not lost on me. Sometimes I'm like, why am I stuck in this work where I constantly grade papers and everybody wants to say, but I didn't get an A minus, not an A. Why an A minus? I could be doing better work somewhere else. And then election years come along and this is why I'm in higher education. Because I am where I need to be to make sure that no one abuses this book for their own personal gain. That's not how they're supposed to use the Bible. Anything else? We're good? What should I say to close it all? So, Jesus showed that we have to change the way we think and allow ourselves to feel like outcasts if we ever want to heal our community and make whole again. However, the idea of a society and the idea of a common good is currently dismissed as notions that are, communist, socialist, however you want to call them, and they're not biblical at all. When that's exactly what the Bible tries to do. Establish a cohesive community. Thank you. I don't have homework, I have a question. Today I did an overview of social justice. Next time, what I want to do is read with you a story so that we can all read a bit. Would you prefer that? Okay. So what I think I'm going to do is I want to read with you the book of Ruth. Would you like it? So for next Sunday, have a Bible. We're all going to read a couple of verses, and I will ask you a few questions about community and social justice. How about that? Good? Okay, thank you.